Hello everyone, welcome to yet another day in this, the Clown Decade, the decade where things are only going to get worse before they get better. And today you can probably see this as a part 2 to this video I released last week, which is the ethnicity debate where Fraser Nelson was claiming that Rishi Sunak was English and Konstantin Chrisin was saying that Rishi Sunak can't be English, and they were kind of both right but just talking past each other. To distill the hour and a half thoughts that I had in that video into a single tweet, I would use this one to describe what I was largely saying there. It's always fun to stalk the Who is English Discord on Twitter, which is so laden with ulterior motives and willful misapprehensions that it's a wonder anyone is able to keep up the facade. English is polysemantic, meaning it can have multiple uses. Sunak couldn't be from anywhere else, he is culturally English. He is obviously not the product of Jute-Saxon crossbreeding, and I'm not sure anyone is saying that, and I would actually go further and say absolutely nobody is saying that. However, being born here and going to English schools with a lot of other English people, which he did do, he was not put in one of those schools where you had only one or two native English people, and growing up and developing his English habits and customs, I am with this particular tweet, which is from a locked account, so obviously I'm not going to advertise who this is from, but I found it a very agreeable tweet. However, Fraser Nelson was not saying that, obviously, he had ancestry from England, or he was part of the gene pool, which is where Kissin's main point was really coming from, which is, well, to be English, isn't there an, well, heritage component, an ancestry component? And I would say there is, to an extent, but to a lot of English people, or most English people, it's not the be-all and end-all. And if Rishi Sunak, again, if Rishi Sunak describes himself as English, and the English generally accept him as English in this cultural way, then for all intents and purposes, he is English. But to make it very clear, I'm also with Konstantin Chrisin in that he can never be English, because obviously he does not have the genetic component, which requires to be part of the ancestral and genetic group of being English. It's all very complicated, it's why it took me over an hour. Don't worry, this video is not going to be that long. Maybe we can erect a culture where we qualify the sense of what we mean someone to be English, that might be useful, or you could just engage in good faith and not suppose the most absurd interpretations of every statement. I am definitely with that last sentence. However, I think the second to last sentence is something that is also just kind of happening. What do I mean by that? Well, we're going to go over to Suella Braverman now, who frankly had pretty much the same upbringing as Rishi Sunak, where both her parents are of Indian heritage, but they actually came from different parts of the empire, but from Kenya and Mauritius. But her entire upbringing was in England. In fact, I think it was in Wembley. And again, she went to schools that, again, weren't largely diverse, and so she integrated quite well, yet she doesn't call herself English. To be absolutely fair, I've not actually seen evidence of Rishi Sunak calling himself English. So really, once again, I think everyone's talking past each other. And I think we're basically going through a time where, obviously because of the culture war, we're coming up with more rigid definitions for what English and British mean, which I don't have any problem with. My only point really is that historically, English was largely a civic identity, and I know that annoys a lot of people, and I want to make it clear, I am not ignoring the heritage and ancestry side of being English. However, it is absolutely true that we have had waves of people coming into the country and integrating quite well. Best example is the Huguenots. Now, again, does that mean that we need to let absolutely everyone in and try and get them integrated? No, obviously not. The problem is that leftists are saying that, and that is what needs to be beaten. But if you go all the other way and become fully ethno-nationalist, one, I don't think you're going to win, and two, I don't think you're going to win because historically in England and Britain, that's not quite how the thought process has been. It certainly has been for some people, and especially in the 19th century, there were especially some people in the scientific community who were very, let's say, eugenic about the whole thing, but it was never really, from what I can tell anyway, the widespread accepted way that we define people that way. Otherwise, we'd never accept Huguenots and Jews as, well, British or English. Anyway, I think at this point we'll get into the article. I will never be truly English. Here is why. For decades, political leaders have been afraid to celebrate Englishness for fear of being labelled nationalistic or xenophobic. So if there's one thing we can definitely take away from this, it is that Suella Braverman does not self-identify as English, and therefore cannot be English. She has failed one of the two basic tests for which ethnicity you belong to. do you self-identify with that particular ethnicity, and does that particular ethnicity, largely the majority of people who are of that ethnicity, especially natively of that ethnicity, accept you as being one of their own? Well, Suella Braverman's failed the former, so she's not English, so let's see what she has to say. A digital storm erupted over a deceptively simple question. What does it mean to be English? On one side stands Fraser Nelson, formerly of this parish, insisting that being born in England automatically grants one the title of English. On the other, Konstantin Kissin, the podcaster, arguing that Englishness is an ethnic identity, one not simply inherited through geography. Konstantin Kissin's completely right there, by the way. Fraser Nelson was really bad at putting his argument forward. Yes, being born somewhere does not make one of that country. That is absurd. I don't think Fraser Nelson would say, for instance, that George Orwell was Indian. And unfortunately, Fraser Nelson did actually double down on this as he wrote his own article in the Times, a snippet of which is here, which is showing why he really doesn't like this argument or discussion at all. Because Fraser brought up Humza Yousaf, and while he had plenty of enemies when he was elected SNP leader, no one questioned his Scottishness, which I then have to ask, where were you, Fraser? A lot of people were questioning that. The highest profile one I can think of was George Galloway. When Sunak lit Diwali candles and put them on his Downing Street steps, no one cared, let alone claimed it was an un-English thing to do. I just think a lot of people didn't particularly notice. However, I do think it's not particularly un-English to delve into other religious practices. Britain has largely been uninterested in religion for about 50 years at this point. It's pretty sunk in that religion doesn't matter to the English psyche. I think that's changing, by the way. And again, this is probably why this is started to become such a conversation. But he goes on to let the mask slip of why he just avoids this conversation entirely, because Trump's election seems to have changed things, as has Elon Musk's regime on X. Once unsayable points are now being loudly proclaimed and actively promoted, often by Musk himself. For example, earlier this month there was a Make Europe Great Again rally in Madrid, named after one of Musk's tweets. Yesterday, we were heretics, delighted Viktor Orban told the crowd, and now we are the mainstream. This reflects a general mood of Europe's populist right. Tomorrow now belongs to them. We can see this in the rise of the AfD in this weekend's German election, again headed by a lesbian in a multiracial marriage. The electoral humiliation of Emmanuel Macron, the popularity of Marine Le Pen, and in Nigel Farage's reform coming top in every UK opinion poll. So what might be next? What other verboten topics are we now ready to embrace? Is it time to talk even more directly about Muslims? Well, discuss whether there can be such a thing as a patriotic British Pakistani. Well, with so many companies abandoning wokery or diversity, equity and inclusion, might it be acceptable to ask if ethnic minorities were a DEI hire, promoted on skin colour rather than ability? Again, it's like stepping through the looking glass. A lot of these conversations were on Twitter already. It's just obviously with Musk's change to things, it's a lot harder to actually block people out and not see these conversations anymore. Possibly why this is now becoming mainstream. Again, say what you like about Musk, he is obviously a net positive for this. But again, it's just letting the mask slip. The problem Fraser Nelson has is that he never had to address any of this, so his mind never really went beyond, well, he was born here, so he must be English. And that's never really flown with anyone. That's not why people are generally accepting of, say, Rishi Sunak being English, if he so claims. And again, I don't think he's actually ever claimed that. I think he's only ever claimed to be British, which, as we will go through, we seem to be having a more defined split on this, where British is, well, Englishness but just civic, and Englishness obviously requires the hereditary or ancestral requirement. Which, if it's what the words end up being largely defined to, I don't actually have a problem with. Again, my only point is that that's not how they're quite defined at the moment. Anyway, he finishes off with, perhaps it's safe now for reform activists to refer to the leader of the opposition as Olukemi Olufunto Adegoke Badenoch, which, why would it be unacceptable to refer to her as a full name? Again, if she is English or British, as you are going to try and say, why would it be a bad thing to point out her entire name, and three of them happen to be quite African? The Badenoch, by the way, is English. No, sorry, it's Scottish actually, British at the very least. And so marrying into the British tribe, so to speak, makes her one of the British. That should be enough for you, but Fraser Nelson is so he's just blocked out this entire argument from his head. He doesn't really know how to actually make any refutations to ethno-nats, because they have been suppressed for so long. But I think it's a legitimate position, and I don't think it's something you can just put away and ignore. The thing is that I've had about a 6-year head start on this compared to Fraser, and that's why my ideas on this are so well developed. And ask if she's just there because she's black. Well, we know she's just there because she's black, to be fair. That's less of a question and more of a statement, to be honest with you. Anyway, point made, he's doubled down and clearly is having a bit of an existential crisis on actually having to deal with this issue. But now we go back to Suella Braverman, who has firmly planted her flag in, well, being English means you need the ancestry. Which, if that's her view on Englishness, fine. She won't define herself as English. What's the issue? This exchange reveals a deeper anxiety. Britain, and particularly England, is in the throes of an identity crisis. The fallout of unprecedented migration, cultural fragmentation, and the collapse of multiculturalism has left many wondering where our nation is headed. But to preserve something, we must first define it, and therein lies our confusion. Which was my point, by the way. They're talking past each other because they're using two definitions of the word English. As the debate between Fraser and Constantine has shown, English identity remains profoundly unsettled. And again, yes, that's because it has multiple definitions. Englishness has never been static or simple. That's absolutely true. From the arrival of the Romans to the... didn't really exist in the Roman time, to the waves of Saxons, Vikings and Normans, English culture has always absorbed and adapted. How many generations must pass before one can claim to be English? 5, 6? It's a question without an easy answer. And it's not a static answer either, as nothing about this will ever be. As someone who moves over from France, if they marry into an English family, historically we have precedent to say, with even just one generation after that, you have English people. Just look at Isambard Kingdom Brunel. His father was French and fled France during the Revolution, went to America, came to England, married an English woman, and then Isambard Kingdom Brunel was seen as fully English. As we are clearly seeing here, the Indians have a bit more difficult time convincing people of that. Why is that? Well, as Enoch Powell said, frankly, it's the complexion. It's an immediate signifier of difference, but is not a difference in and of itself. Hence, as he always says, the integration of them is not impossible, but it is difficult. It is difficult for them, for all practical purposes, to be indistinguishable from Englishmen. Ironically enough, it's probably easier for Suella Braverman to be considered English than Rishi Sunak, because Rishi Sunak is Hindu, which is not obviously historically a particularly English religion. However, Suella Braverman is actually Christian, or at the very least her parents were Christian, so it's probably actually easier for her to claim the Englishness, and yet she still doesn't. Which is, I just find this whole conversation very fascinating. It's why I end up talking about it for ages. But she goes on to say, if we are to defend Judeo-Christian civilization, British values and the distinctiveness of English culture, there must be some form of consensus. And that's just absolutely true. The whole reason we're having a conversation about this is because, you know, there was a consensus throughout, say, the Victorian period and before. However, you go through the 20th century and you have all these people trying to subvert the already existing civic identity, and you end up with absolutely ridiculous claims like, oh, a British value is democracy, which is only really true for about, at this point, a century, which, given we have 1,000 years of history, kinda hard to claim that. English identity is strangely muted. I'd push back on this a bit. I don't think it's necessarily muted. I think it's just been largely internationalised, largely because English and British are incredibly interchangeable, because British is just English civil identity, but pushed onto other people. Which, because now everyone's effectively swimming in British identity, especially in the British Isles, well, apart from obviously the colonies, then like a fish in water, it becomes hard for that fish to define the water. Historically, it's language, dress, the institutions of empire. Again, is that English or is that British? Were its defining features, but these have been exported so successfully that they no longer feel distinctly English. Oh, she's nailed it. Fair enough. So what remains? Cricket and ale? Yes. A stiff upper lip? Oh, well, mostly, yes. Polite reserve? Mostly, yes. It's hard to say. Not really. Cricket is still quite uniquely English in so far as we play cricket and not every other nation does. Just because other nations play cricket does not mean that it is not unique to England. I also don't know why ale wouldn't be. I don't know any other country that largely drinks ale. What we do know is that many are struggling to name what it is that makes someone or something English. This is only really true when you're talking outside of native English people. No one particularly had trouble saying Jihadi John was English. However, obviously, we had such trouble saying that Shamima Begum was English that we stripped her of her British citizenship. Which screams to me, as I said in the last video, that there's obviously some sort of ancestry component to being English. It's just, as I say, it's quite low on the value hierarchy of being English. Which is fine, by the way, it's still there, obviously. This lack of definition is at the heart of the crisis. For decades, political leaders have been hesitant to assert Englishness for fear of being labelled nationalistic or xenophobic. That's definitely true. But that timidity has diluted the national identity to the point where anything seems to qualify. In Fraser's words, all it takes to join the tribe is a plane ticket and a birth certificate. This is a reduction of identity to mere geography and explains why we see clashes on our streets between Hindus and Muslims over conflicts thousands of miles away. That is a spicy paragraph, and she has absolutely nailed it. This is stuff I've been talking about on this channel for literally years. This has now made the mainstream. If you want the definition of a vibe shift, it is this article. This is great stuff. This liberal tendency explains why there are neighbourhoods in England where English is irregularly spoken, Western dress is abandoned, women and girls are subjugated, and loyalty to Britain is not just absent but often opposed. I mean, that is just absolutely true as well. Honestly, you go on TikTok, it can be quite radicalising if you just keep scrolling through the lives, especially when there is a foreign national holiday going on. There are absolutely loads of live streams when it's, say, Pakistan Independence Day, where there are just people out on obviously English streets. You can tell by the architecture of the buildings in these streets, and it's just absolutely rammed with Pakistani people with Pakistani flags, waving them about, singing and cheering in Urdu or whatever they speak in Pakistan. I'm pretty sure it's Urdu. And obviously this is where the UK Aesthetics Twitter account has developed from, because there's just so many examples of this. How can anyone claim that people like that are English? English people don't typically celebrate in large scale Pakistan Independence Day because it's nothing to do with the English, and that's all Suella Braverman is particularly saying here. Some in these communities may hold British passports and be born here, but does that make them English? This is a point that I've made before. It kind of used to. It doesn't anymore because they've been given out like confetti since, well, the Blair era. And this is why there is a big redefinition of the whole thing. There have been acts of parliament in the past where effectively all the act of parliament is to say is, right, officially, you know, these Jews are now seen as English, you know, they've been naturalised. And there was obviously large-scale pushback on stuff like that, because I think the Jewish Nationalisation Act came about due to some Jewish communities being loyal to, I think it was the Glorious Revolution. I'm trying to get my dates right here, but they were loyal to, obviously, people in Parliament, and so they passed that. But the average British person thought, you can't just give them that, they're not integrated yet. Yet you skip 100 years from the 18th to 19th century, and then basically everyone just accepts Disraeli as one of their own, despite the fact he only has Jewish ancestry. Which is where my whole point of, there's kind of always been a civic identity there comes from. And obviously, largely because of Tony Blair era, we can't now say having a British passport makes one British. Or English in this case, because, as I say, they're just way too easy to get. In my own case, Suella Braverman says, I disagree with Fraser. I was born here, raised to speak the Queen's English, hang on, that's Queen's English now, and educated in England, yet I'm not English. My parents, members of the Indian diaspora, were born in Kenya and Mauritius. They acquired British citizenship, but they were not and could never be considered English. I wouldn't go that far necessarily. It obviously depends on the specifics of her parents, but I reckon it is quite clear that people can integrate to the point of being seen as English. Obviously, as I said before, it's probably easier for a Scotsman, say, to integrate into Englishness than, say, her Indian parents, who obviously came, again, throughout the empire, but again from foreign countries. But she stuck her flag in that they can never be considered English, so that's her perspective, so fair enough. I don't think it's illegitimate, I just disagree slightly. For English, again, to make it very clear, ancestry part, obviously they can never be English. For Englishness to mean something substantial, it must be rooted in ancestry, heritage and ethnicity, just not residence or fluency. Again, it's the whole ethnicity question. I go through it largely in the other videos, so I'm only going to touch upon it here, but ethnicity is whatever the in-group defines as that ethnicity. Britain has ancestry and heritage quite low on the hierarchy of values for being English, so as far as I care, or at least can tell, it doesn't really matter to two or enough English people the heritage to say Rishi Sunak is not considered English, which is what Fraser Nelson's point should have been but wasn't. And that's no slight against those of us with different roots. I don't feel English because I have no generational ties to English soil, no ancestral stories tied to towns or villages of this land. Completely legitimate. This is the self-identity question. Do you feel English, Suella Braverman? No, I do not, because I have no history here, effectively. And that's fine. That is absolutely fine. And if that's how English gets defined, well, from this point forward, I have absolutely no issue with that whatsoever. Language changes all the time, I understand that. And if we're distincting British to be purely the civic nationality, which has always been the case, and English to require these ancestral ties, totally fine. It's perfectly legitimate. Again, my point is that for, I'd say, probably 200 years, something like that, it has not been necessary. If it becomes necessary now, obviously because of the massive influx of mass migration, and that changes the conditions that the English people find themselves in, completely understandable, completely fine. And you know what? I might even somewhat support it. There is absolutely nothing wrong with this article so far, and it's very strange that I'm going through an article and saying, wow, I actually agree with pretty much everything here. The bits I disagree with, frankly, are nitpicks. There is a problem, though, if we do redefine it as needing ancestral ties as to how you deal with the Norman Tebbit question or the Enoch Powell question. If you play cricket for England or support the English cricket team, you are generally seen as integrated, and therefore could be considered English. However, if we do redefine it to mean that you need ancestral ties, well then, that still kicks up a bit of dirt and dust into that question. But as I say, all this stuff's complicated. It's why it's a major issue in the culture war and has been for some time. It's just been slingshotted right in front of everyone's faces, and I'm glad it's being discussed. I think we need to come to a consensus on this, as Suella Braverman says. Suella goes on, my heritage with its rich culture and racial identity is something distinct. I am British Asian, and I feel a deep love, gratitude and loyalty to this country, but I cannot claim to be English, nor should I. So, again, completely legitimate. This is not exclusionary, it is honest, and it's what living in a multi-ethnic society entails. Yeah? I lived in France for a couple of years, I spoke the language fluently and adopted aspects of French life, yet I never thought for a moment that I could ever claim to be French. Identity doesn't work that way. True, it wouldn't if you only lived there for a couple of years. However, if you stayed there for decades, renounced your British citizenship and became a French citizen, and became, well, culturally integrated into France, well, maybe there could be a case there. Because this was a thing that really, really annoyed French people when, I think, was it Trevor Noah on The Daily Show said, oh, Africa finally won the World Cup, and he put a picture of the French team up. Really annoyed the French there. Because those black guys represented France, not an African nation. So again, this whole thing's quite complicated. The same must hold true for, again, the French obviously have ancestry as well, which again, probably comes into an aspect of it. I don't know the way the French think, but there we go. The same must hold true for Englishness. No, this is where people get muddled up in this whole conversation. Literally does not matter how other group identities think of themselves. The only thing that matters is how the English think of themselves. This approach is common in other countries. In Japan, for example, citizenship is generally based on descent. We actually don't have to copy Japan. There are other countries out there, obviously, that base this whole thing on descent. I don't think that's ever going to happen in Britain, because Britain has obviously had an empire of the past. Obviously, we've had people immigrate over here, and dissenters never really, even before the Tony Blair era, ever really been exclusionary to British citizenship. Obviously, when it comes to Englishness, different story, because they're different in-groups. I mean, for example, it's kind of a bad paragraph, this, because I don't think Suella Braverman is saying that her British citizenship should be revoked, but if we were more like Japan, it would actually have to be probably revoked. The only way she might get to keep it is, well, via marriage, because she married a Brit. I'm sure these views will send progressive elites into a tailspin. Oh, it absolutely will. I don't mind it, because I've heard these arguments before and have always thought there's some legitimacy to them. It won't be long before someone accuses me of being a fascist, but we, especially those of us on the right, must stop being so squeamish about national identity. Yeah, absolutely. To preserve British values and English culture, we need clarity, not denial. To call this divisive or racist is to dodge a necessary conversation about who we are and where we're heading. And I think it's legitimate, and no one's going to get everything right. I don't even necessarily think I've got everything right. Hell, I'm sure there's stuff I've said in this video that directly contradicts stuff I said in the last video. We're talking about complex human social systems. No one's ever going to get anything 100% right. They're the most complex thing in the world. She finishes with this paragraph: for too long we have treated nationality and citizenship casually and as interchangeable concepts, unwilling to confront the deeper cultural issues. I mean, there's definitely an issue here, but again, she's throwing around words and using some of them interchangeably. She seems to be using nationality as a substitute for ethnicity here, which in turn she specifically means in terms of heritage and ancestry. And this is the really difficult thing about this conversation, and why everyone needs to approach it with good faith, and hardly anyone seems to. Because these are concepts that really we've not particularly thought about and had a proper conversation about in the zeitgeist, people are using words interchangeably that they probably shouldn't be. Nationality and citizenship are pretty much the same thing. However, you can also use nationality and ethnicity to pretty much mean the same thing. It depends what group you're talking about, yet again. But overall, the argument here is absolutely true. Having British citizenship does not mean that one is particularly loyal to the nation, and your nationality should be reflective of which nation you are loyal to. And if the particular national group and the larger ethnic group consider nationality to be the most important thing to be part of that ethnicity, it makes you part of that ethnicity. And Britain has somewhat of a history of defining it like that. Unfortunately, Tony Blair happened, mass immigration happened, citizenship was handed out like confetti, and we can no longer define it as that. This is why this is such a big culture war issue, and this is why I'm totally accepting of these definitions to be redefined. Because it's not a leftist way of doing it, of just automatically changing the definition of a word, going forward and saying this is the only definition that matters. Why are you not making this the only definition that matters? Why are you pretending it means something else? There is an acceptance that, yeah, this is a really complicated issue. Let's actually talk about it. This is my position. That's all Suella Braverman has done here, and I agree with 90% of it. And largely, I believe this would be the reform position. So, it's good stuff. Thank you, Suella, for writing this. I said years ago that multiculturalism has failed. We are now living in the wreckage of that failure. Our identity crisis is the result of decades of neglect, complacency and cowardice. We have allowed what once made England distinctive to be diluted, denigrated, and demolished. Now more than ever we must define what it is we are fighting for before it slips away entirely. So as I say, very good article. My issues are largely nitpicks, but hey, that's what this channel's for. And when it comes to Suella Braverman's ethnic identity, she's called herself British, and the British accept her, therefore she's British. She doesn't call herself English, despite probably the fact that I think most English people would accept that identity as well. But she's gone down the route of the ancestry component matters too much for her to identify as English, so fair enough, that's her own perspective on it. And before I finish this video, I just had a quick look through Twitter, and I just saw one of the funniest things, and why the whole ethnicity debate is so screwed up. So Owen Jones has just tweeted this out, saying, "Don't be so effing ridiculous, you're English, get over it." We're at a point where ethnicity, which again is largely self-defined and also largely group-defined, but does absolutely require both, is being shoved onto people who are rejecting the identity. Believe it or not, Owen Jones, you can't demand someone identify with a particular ethnic group. It's basically impossible to do that. Again, I will always use the American issue, where you get all these plastic paddies, even some plastic taffy sometimes as well, and plastic Scots, where they will constantly go on about, oh, you know, I'm Scottish, my granddad came from there or something like that. And, you know, the taxi drivers have to get an earful of how they love Scotland and how they're Scottish, and they absolutely hate them because they put on the most American accent known to man when they do it, and the Scots just think, you may have Scottish blood, but you ain't Scottish, son. Owen Jones, oddly enough, is doing the complete opposite. In that, while these Americans are self-identifying as Scottish and not being Scottish, Suella Braverman is not self-identifying as English, and Owen Jones is saying, oh, but you are English. We're at a point where the left are actively denying people's identity to try and keep their mental outlook on ethnicity going. And as usual with these sorts of things, the answer's somewhere in the middle, and I think Suella Braverman is managing to find that somewhere in the middle, and I think having a distinction between English meaning having more of an ancestry component and British having basically no ancestry component, I think that's a pretty good middle line for that, and as I say, I have absolutely nothing against that. And Owen Jones is never going to realise this, but a large reason we've had to do that is because of his ridiculous worldview effectively being the norm for a few decades, and people finding that it's absolutely ridiculous. Because you can't have people like David Lemmy constantly say they're British, and then when the whole issue of slavery reparations come up, he expects money to be paid to him, rather than he be part of the British people who have to pay the slavery reparations. Anyway, to conclude, this whole thing's still very complicated, and I still agree with the Enoch Powell take on ethnicity and nationality.
He says he's black, but he's British, and he feels British. What is his nationality?
His nationality is the nationality he feels is the nation he'll fight for. Or play cricket for.
In times where we completely lack constant warfare, loyalty to the nation needs proxies. Doing so through cricket and sports teams is the best we've got. However, given we don't have a British football team, say, Suella Braverman still supports England. This is where it all gets a bit complicated. And I think that's where I'll leave it. So with that, I hope you enjoyed the video. In terms of shillings, Saturday it's Laughing at the Guardian with some whamming. Do come along to that. Next Monday we're finishing off the Peloponnesian Wars, hopefully for real this time. We're going on about Sparta being ruined by Macedonia, so do come along to that to the Worcester Club. Tuesday it's Tosh Talks, and I don't know what the topic's going to be yet, but I'm sure it's one that everyone will be interested in. After all, it's voted on. If you want to help out the channel, do subscribe, leave a like and leave a comment telling me what you think. I got a lot of interesting perspectives in the last video I did on English ethnicity, and I'm sure I'm going to get them again. This is an absolutely huge topic. I'm expecting plenty of arguments. As I say, do just try and approach it in good faith, because we're not going to get anywhere approaching it in bad faith. If you want to help the channel out much more directly, you can give a super thanks in the comments of this video, or you can give a super chat whenever I live stream on this channel or over on the Worcester Club. And also you can become a channel member, which gives you full access to all my previous streams, which is a hell of a bargain when you think about it. Right, with that, that's everything I had for you for today. So once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.